These are all deferred items from last month. So I think I can probably be relatively quick going through these. Item number 1 is CUP 21-00026, so Interfaith Sanctuary Housing Services. So this was continued from last month. The public testimony portion of this item has been closed. So it'll really just be up for deliberation for the commission. I think Celine may have a couple words right at the very beginning, very brief, just to get you going. But after that, we'll let you go. Following that, item number 2, PUD 21-54. So this is at 2506 West Targhee Street. This was a PUD you actually heard back in November. Granted at that original hearing, you denied it, then granted a request for reconsideration to allow for a site design. So they are back before you this evening. And we did get some late correspondence from the Vista Neighborhood Association. And we certainly will hear that. I suppose I should just say from the beginning, we'll be hearing all of these items tonight. So item number 3, CAR 21-30 and PUD 21-52 with Erstad Architects. So this is over at 1728 South Annette. So a rezone from R2 to R3D and a conditional use permit for 48 multifamily units. With this as well, we did receive some late correspondence from the neighborhood association, as well as I think maybe a neighbor or two. So we will be hearing this one. Item number 4, CUP 21-57. This was over at 1522 State Street. So a conditional use permit for a parking reduction it's actually a rezone that you heard a couple months ago. We did get some late correspondence as well from this one. So we'll certainly be hearing it. Item number 5, CAR 21-31. So this is a rezone over at 2801 West Palouse Street. So a rezone from R1C to R2D DA. Again, we received some late correspondence from some different folks, including the neighborhood association. And I think we do have 4 or so people signed up in advance for it. Item number 6, CAR 21-33. So this is a rezone over at 1824 South Vanel. So R1A to R1B/DA. We got some late correspondence. It was the project report from ACHD that was included, I believe sent out either Thursday or today. Item number 7, CVA 21-49. Over to variance over at 621 South Johnson Street. We are recommending denial on this, so we will be hearing it. No one's expected to speak from the public or the neighborhood association, though. And then finally, item number 8, CUP 21-53. This is a conditional use permit to convert an office use to single family over at 824 West Franklin Street. We are recommending approval, but the applicant is opposed to a condition that is in relationship to a street side parking setback. So we will be hearing this item as well, not anticipating any public testimony or neighborhood association with it. And any questions on that?
Kevin, I do have a question. Are we, will we be going over the November 6 minutes?
Yes, thank you.
On the consent agenda, on the sole consent item?
Yes,
cool.
We do. Yes, we do have one consent. I think, November is the 8th.
Oh, 8th, yeah.
Minutes.
Thank you.
Yep, so we can certainly pass that on the consent agenda.
Love those minutes.
And then with 1 minute to spare, maybe we'll get your guys' monitors up and running, and then we can just start diving right in.
Thank you.
Right. I can erase it.
Okay. Are we ready? Okay, good.
Perfect. All right, we can begin the main hearing tonight. All right, good evening and welcome to the Boise City Planning and Zoning Commission public hearing. So a few things to start out with for tonight's proceeding. So first off, everyone from the meeting entering the hearing virtually has been automatically muted and cannot speak. As the item you're interested in comes up for discussion, you will be called upon and unmuted. So there's also a chat function in Zoom. This is not part of the record and really should only be used if technical difficulties arise. Our procedures for public hearings begin with a presentation from the planning team. Then we'll go to the applicant and then the representative for the Registered Neighborhood Association. This will be followed by questions from the commission. After that, we proceed to public testimony, starting with those that are in person, then those who signed up on the sign-up sheet in advance, and then anyone else who raises their hand virtually. If you are attending through your telephone, you can type *9 to raise your hand. So each member of the public is allowed up to 3 minutes for testimony. We are strict with this time as it is limited in code. Finally, the applicant is allowed 5 minutes for rebuttal, after which the hearing will be closed and the commission will deliberate and render a decision. Madam Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. We are citizen volunteers appointed by the mayor and approved by the city council. We make final decisions on conditional use permits, variances, and appeals, and recommendations to the city council on subdivisions, rezones, annexations, and code or comprehensive plan amendments. Any decision made tonight may be appealed to the city council, provided that the appeal is filed within 10 days of this hearing. In order to file an appeal, you must have given written or oral testimony at the hearing. So that's why it's important that you give your name and address when you testify tonight. We utilize a consent agenda. That means that if the applicant agrees with the staff report and if there's no public opposition, the item will be placed on the consent agenda. All items that are placed on the consent agenda are approved with one motion without further public comment. For items not on the consent agenda, we will hold a full public hearing in the order just detailed a few moments ago with staff, applicant, neighborhood association, and then the public testimony. Thank you all for attending tonight, and will the clerk please call the roll?
Stead,
Here.
Schaefer,
Here.
Squires, Blanchard,
Here.
Moore,
Here.
Gillespie,
Here.
Binfrock, Danley,
Here.
Mooney.
Here.
7 present, 2 absent.
Okay, without objection, I will place the minutes from our November 8th hearing on the consent agenda. This is the only item for consent tonight. So with that, the chair will entertain a motion.
Madam Chair, I move to approve.
Commissioner Schaefer.
Sorry, apologize. I move that we approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Great, we have a second from Commissioner Moore. If there's no discussion, will the clerk please call the vote?
Stead,
Aye.
Schaefer,
Aye.
Blanchard,
Aye.
Moore,
Aye.
Gillespie,
Aye.
Danley,
Aye.
Mooney.
Aye.
Motion carries, all in favor.
Great. Okay, so we're going to start with item number 1. This is CUP 21-26, deferred from December 13th, 2021. This is for Interfaith Sanctuary Housing Services at 4306 West State Street, a conditional use permit to operate a shelter home. The public portion of this hearing has concluded. It was concluded on December 13th, 2021. And so we will now be entering the commission's deliberation and decision. Before we begin tonight, I just want to remind everyone of the expectations of decorum. There will be no cheering, calling out, or clapping from the audience. It is important that we treat each other with respect. I want to thank you all for your participation on this item because your participation has been important, and equally important is that we treat each other with kindness and respect regardless of opinions. With that in mind, we can now move forward with the commission, and in an effort to keep a clear record, we are going to stick to our approval criteria. And we're hopefully going to work through, Saline.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I believe Commissioner Schaefer needs to recuse himself, so he should be removing himself from the
Thank
dais.
you.
Celine is correct. Recusing myself from this item.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Schaefer. We will see you back afterwards, after this item number 1. Okay, so based on our Commissioner Gillespie, based on our approval criteria, I'm hoping that we can divide the conversation, or at least start by dividing the conversation up into a few different categories, including procedure, compatibility, undue burden to services, site size for intended use, and then adverse impacts. And then we can hit anything else that we've missed in those first buckets, if you will. So we can start with a motion, or we can start with conversation, but the item is now before the commission.
Madam Chairman,
Commissioner Gillespie.
I'll just dive in on the first, what I think of the procedure question, and then the compatibility criteria. So I don't have any problems with the procedure so far. I mean, it's been long, it's been detailed, and I don't have any issues. With respect to compatibility, I think we had heard a lot of people in testimony argue compatibility issues. What I heard mostly was adverse impact issues. For me, compatible means it's fairly narrow. It means, is it allowed by the use table? And if it is, it's compatible. Another thing that I also look at is, are there other similar uses in the neighborhood? There are. In this case, there are. It's conditionally allowed. So I find that the application is compatible according to criteria number 1.
Great. I'd love to hear from other commissioners on these first couple of items, if anybody has anything to add.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Mooney.
regarding procedure, I think it's worthy to call out the applicant and the amount that they've stretched to make this happen. And I just wanted to mention that. The other thing on the procedure that I was struck by was reviewing the Shelter Better Task Force report. I was struck by the tone of that report. And I struggled with it because it seemed to be pointing those folks towards selecting a site, when in fact this is a private charitable organization that has selected a site and is applying under our code for what is appropriate. And I agree with Commissioner Gillespie on the compatibility. I view it the same way.
Thank you. Okay, since our commission has had a lot of time to prepare our deliberation, I'll just keep moving through our bullet points here.
Okay.
Assuming that if somebody has something to add, they'll
Madam
jump
Chairman.
in. Commissioner Gillespie.
So our second point is the proposed use will not place an undue burden on transportation and other public facilities in the vicinity. I think we heard testimony that basically raised the issue of, would this place an undue burden on the police infrastructure? That seemed to me to be the most salient testimony. We discussed at some length in the record a police facility that was built in the past to serve the number of calls, and whether or not this was a wise use of city resources, et cetera. We had the testimony from both the police chief and the fire chief. Basically, I did not hear them say this is placing an undue burden on us. So I find that the applicant has met criteria 2, and that from the city's overall perspective, this is not an undue burden.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can add something to that. I would agree with that. I mean, that's what it sounded like. We'd hear more of a shifting in services than additional services needed. And they both seem to agree that that's something that they could accommodate.
And Madam Chairman, might I must
Gillespie.
add here for everybody, I'm not an expert on security or fire issues. So in my job up here is to evaluate the testimony of other experts. So I look at their credibility, I look at their relevance, and I look at what they said in the record. That is what the police chief and the fire chief said to me, although I do agree or would also point out that, you know, their testimony was somewhat ambiguous on some respects.
And I would add that we do that with all kinds of experts, whether it's a hillside permit and we're hearing from engineers or, I mean, there are ACHD. I mean, there's 100 reasons why it's outside of our purview. And so I agree with Commissioner Gillespie that, you know, we have to rely on the experts in that situation.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Danley.
this will be where we disagree. Probably no surprise there. I understand the sentiment of what was said in terms of the testimony. I get that. The police department was neutral. They didn't say one way or the other. They said that they were neutral. So when I say that, and in the report that we have, it talks about it's reasonable to expect calls for service, that there's going to be an increase in, you know, it's in CFS anytime high density or otherwise. It says to effectively address the higher call or service loads of proposed area, BPD's limited resources will be impacted. Limited resources will be impacted. It also talks about the notion of potentially required to reallocate resources when we just reallocated from one side of town sort of to the other. And I keep going back to the SEPTED report. The SEPTED report, I've in 15 years of private practice in the planning profession, in the 4 years of being on this commission, I've never seen language as stark as this. And the language that says right here, with the anticipated increase in PD calls to the surrounding area of the proposed shelter, the public safety impact would be significant. Community members who are concerned about public safety should consider opposing the move to Interfaith Sanctuary based on these anticipated significant public safety impacts. I don't know how much more direct an organization can be than that. And our fire department said essentially something very similar, in that services would be degraded across the entire city, not just in the service area. So when we look at our charter through LUPA's pretty clear, and it starts off with the notion of us and every other commission in the state of Idaho having the responsibility to uphold public health, safety, and the general welfare of the people of this city. So when we have a police department that says that services will be degraded and, you know, a lot of, I'm assuming then safety compromised, I don't know how we would be upholding LUPA. Go to our code. Our code says the exact same thing in about 4 or 5 different locations about our responsibility of upholding, again, public health, safety, general welfare, and so forth and so on. In addition to that, we talk about in our plan, what does our plan says? PDP 5, require adequate public facilities and infrastructure for all development. Goal PDP 8, require that the financial, safety, and environmental impacts from development be addressed and mitigated. That's pretty clear. Oh, by the way, a plan, that what our plan says is also a requirement of a conditional use permit. So if those two things are not compatible, then we have missed the mark. That was precisely the request made 3 times, not once, not twice, 3 times, to try to get that information, to get this application closer to the finish line. That's what that was all about. So that's where I'll stop at this point.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
So I share Chris's concern, and I'm sorry, Commissioner Danley's concern. I guess the problem, and I'd like other people to talk about it, we have, is that we've got this earlier report. We don't know, you know, we know some things about it, but then we basically had the police chief's testimony where he did not repeat those points. So I guess the question I have for Commissioner Danley and others who might agree with him is, what do we do with the fact that we've got this earlier report and now we have the police chief and the fire chief's testimony, which,
Contradicts it.
you know, basically you asked more than once, right? You took 3-4 pretty hearty swings at it. And what's your sense of what they said?
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Blanchard.
here, I'm going to use an analogy for Commissioner Gillespie on this one. He's a private sector businessman. So imagine this, Commissioner Gillespie, that you as the CEO are called in front of your board of directors, that's us, and you've just lost your top selling product. And they said, so what's your plan, CEO Gillespie, for this? And you essentially said what Chief Lee and Chief Niemeyer said. That's where I'm at on this, is they essentially gave us non-testimony, essentially exactly as Commissioner Danley has stated. So they got up there and said, well, we'll just deal with it. Well, if you told your board of directors that about a product, well, we'll just deal with it. I mean, I wouldn't have a lot of confidence, and I don't.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Danley.
So my answer to that, it's a good question. And again, I understand the conflict here. But if the issue was resolved and there is no degraded service, then why is a condition of approval of the applicant then to develop a contingency plan for how the staff's going to address, how there's going to be a security plan, why there's going to be a de-escalation plan? If everything is okay, then why would those things be necessary, right? They are necessary. At this point in time, for example, 25% of the time, the applicant's location is allowed to exceed what is on our application now for number of folks. What's going to happen at that point? Will more security be added? Will different types of security be added? We don't know. How will people who are coming in, families, vulnerable, and someone who is meeting the threshold, who is intoxicated, who is under the influence of a drug that unfortunately does alter behavior? We know that to be the case. How are those people supposed to be kept safe? And so my last point here would be, at the last hearing, I had mentioned we're not security experts. I agree, we're not. But we absolutely, according to LUPA and our code, have the responsibility to, at the very least, understand what those steps are going to be and make determination. And if they are conditions of approval, so be it. But we have none of that.
Sorry, I would argue that you say we have none of that, but we do have conditions of approval, and it does include a security plan.
It requires the generation thereof. That's fine, but the public isn't going to see that.
Commissioner Mooney.
No, I'm in. Let's let other people talk for
Yeah.
Because
Exactly.
I don't want this to be the Milton Chris show.
No, actually, and I'll.
Because that's a
reiterate,
bad
the reason
show.
that we have the bucketing, that we're kind of trying to do these bullet points is to prevent, is to prevent that, so that we can hear from other commissioners. So I appreciate the perspective, Commissioner Danley. This is really important conversation. And I think we hear you on that concern. Was it Commissioner Mooney? Did you have something to add?
Yeah, Madam Chair. I guess I deferred to the expert testimony that we heard. And I agree with Chris and Commissioner Blanchard and Danley in that they were challenged, and it was kind of a non-testimonial. I mean, it was basically, trust us, this is our expertise, and we will do that. What I heard from the applicant on the security plan was that they can't devise that plan until they know what the conditions of approval are. So it's after the fact generation of a detailed security and operational plan, which I think Commissioner Blanchard asked for as well.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
And to tag on to that, I think that is exactly what I was thinking. It seems to me that it is based on those conditions of approval. And maybe the problem here isn't necessarily that we don't have that, isn't necessarily that we don't have it, but that it's not well defined. So maybe part of the conversation is figuring out, what do we want from this security plan? Like, what's the end goal here? And then those definitions can get worked out by the experts, but maybe we have an end goal in mind, or maybe based off our list of adverse impacts and impacts to the surrounding neighbors, there's an end goal that we can define.
I mean, I agree with that, because maybe then the solution to your saying, to Commissioner Danley's stating that there's no, like, what happens if it doesn't work? Well, that can be part of the condition. We have the authority to revise these conditions until we're comfortable with them, if that's the case, if that's the direction we go. And so maybe it is after a certain amount of time, the Boise PD comes back to reevaluate and gives a different approval, or, things like that. I think that there are ways that we can work through some of those concerns.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
So just so we kind of in our mind are keeping track of conditions, because at some point we might try to stack up conditions.
Yes.
So I think Commissioner Chris Danley raised a good point on basically site condition specific 4, which is this allowing for emergency overflow. And Commissioner Danley is saying, well, what happens if that's like 50 people? Do they have to add staff? Well, one simple condition change we could make is just to eliminate that whole condition after the first sentence. So if you look at condition 4, the facility is limited to a maximum of 205 beds, excluding cribs, period. And then all that other stuff we could just take out, because we don't want any emergency overflow for some of the reasons that Commissioner Chris Danley was talking about. So that's within our power to do that, right? To alter that condition in that way. I also might point out that if in the future the applicant had demonstrated their ability to manage the situation, they can always come back to the commission or the director and put that or some language around it back in, right? So it's not an all or nothing forever deal. But that's just one example of a condition change I noted to just try to eliminate what I consider to be the uncertainty that is bothering all of us, right? Because what this is really about is uncertainty. We don't know what the plan is. We don't know how well it will be executed. And different ones of us have different ideas about the level of certainty we want to see on the record. So that's kind of where I'm at. And by the way, we haven't even gotten to the blockbuster criteria 4, which is adverse impact, which is to me where all, the real excitement is.
Okay, well,
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Mooney. Oh, Commissioner Blanchard. I'm sorry, Commissioner Blanchard.
can I, as we're kind of talking through, because I see the path that we're going down here is trying to formulate what possible conditions we would place on this. I just kind of want to give a view of where I see this heading. We can either condition this thing, and there's going to be how many commissioners are here, and there's going to be 6 times however many commissioners here, number of opinions that we're going to get on what conditions. So that to say that we'll probably never agree on any condition plan. And 2, the applicant likely isn't interested in those conditions and will appeal. So I think it just seems to me it would be an easier direction if we made a motion to either approve or deny and let everybody get on the record with what they think the issues are. That would be, I think, a little bit easier, because we're going to generate 50 or 60 conditions here, and we're not going to there's no way we're going to come to any sense of accord on that. Just my feedback.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
I like the idea, but I'm at a place now where I cannot approve the permit with this set of conditions. So there are some edits that I have to see to vote yes, just for me. And then I have a a whole couple of conditions where I'm like, I don't know if they're a bad idea or not on, you know, sort of ongoing compliance guarantees that we don't typically try to write into conditions. And I'm open to ideas on whether that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Meany.
I had the same thoughts about ongoing mitigation or regular reviews, maybe a time limited thing. Commissioner Blanchard's comment about the applicant may not be willing to entertain any conditions that we impose from the dais. I don't know if I agree with that. What I heard from the applicant is they'll do almost anything, and they've demonstrated that by pausing their application and participating in Shelter Better Task Force.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
And additionally, for conditional use permits, we're the deciding body. I think it's our responsibility to decide it how we believe appropriate and not rely on an appeal or a court case or anything like that. I think it's our responsibility to apply those conditions or deny if that's what we so choose, but it's up to us to do that.
Yeah, well said, Commissioner Moore. Yeah, let's just continue with our conversation here with the themes as previously outlined, and we'll see kind of where we end up with things.
Madam Chair, I've got a
Meany.
really minor undue burden of services comment regarding what we've said thus far is new streetlights, upgraded transit stop, library security, things like that. One of the things that came up in testimony from the public, which was concern about pedestrian crossings and the State Street corridor and the complete lack of pedestrian facilities on the south side of State Street. I think we missed that as far as infrastructure in that general area. It's off-site, so I could see where it's not something that can be conditioned.
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
I agree with that. Actually, that was one of the items that I have on my list. It was kind of some of those bus stops and access to the green belt. Those are large factors to this location. Undue burden on pedestrian facilities, crossings, and things like that. I think those are important in the undue burden category. So I'm totally agreeing with it.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Danley.
Before we move on, I guess I appreciate the attempt to potentially thread the needle here. I definitely do. It's a difficult application to say the least. At the end of the day, we had 400-ish letters to the city asking us to deny this application, and another at least 100 testify to do the same. When I heard and read all the arguments, to me, so much of them really boiled down to the one issue. You know, when we talk about the property values, we talk about the potential next bucket, all of those things, it all came down to this security. If it's secure, it seemed like a lot of these other sort of satellite pieces of the argument might sort of be mitigated. So my biggest concern is if we condition this and go forth and this significant amount of information is created but not presented to the public, then the public will never have a chance to comment on their thoughts of this. And as I mentioned in almost the first hearing, we have more information on bus stops than we do about what probably is the real main concern of this application. And I just don't know that that's right.
Yeah, I get it.
I think that they should have a chance to read and at least chime in. And if we mitigate, change, whatever, that's up to us potentially. But I don't see why the public shouldn't be part of that discussion.
Commissioner Gillespie.
I think that's an outstanding point, and one that as I tried to, you know, I've got like pages of conditions to try to essentially guarantee compliance, because one of the conditions, our code says that we can implement conditions to guarantee compliance with the other conditions, right? So we can clearly do it, but it's hard to construct in a condition, a process that is public, right? It would all be a report that is reviewed and approved by the director on an annual basis, or, like these annual neighborhood meetings. They're not really fully public record. And so I am really struggling with this issue. Just almost, it's like a procedural point in a way. So I think that's a really difficult question. Because, Madam Chairman, excuse me. I think what Chris and Chris are saying is, look, if we just deny it, then they can come back with a better security plan that they wrote, not us at the dais, and then we can hear it all over again. None of us want to do that, but I sense them saying they feel that that procedure is a better procedure, more public.
Commissioner Gillespie.
Going through the bucket.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking, okay, we'll move on to the next bucket. Okay, so moving on, then it's site size for intended use.
Madam Chairman. Oh, sorry.
Commissioner Moore.
Madam Chair, I think one of my biggest things, and I, with all of the testimony, can't find the exact reference, but I think I remember hearing or reading something about a phased approach for that day use shelter. And I think the biggest thing for me in this particular bucket is just ensuring that there's no phased approach to that particular portion of the use, because it is so integral to where residents will go during the day. So making sure that if that back building is in fact not built because of construction costs or what have you, it's allotted for somewhere on site. That way, the program as we understand it is available. Mm-hmm. I think that's my biggest concern in this particular bucket.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
So I kept very careful notes of the 141 people. By the way, Tim Flaherty gets the Last Man Standing Award for the last person to testify. Remember Corey Erickson, the Phantom?
I do.
And we did have one person, well, VP&A did have a whole thread related to parking, which is related to this bucket. They basically thought the number should be 41. I think the number in the record is 26 or 27. I'm comfortable with the 26 or 27. And so I didn't have any issues with criteria 3. The only one I heard was parking. We did hear another person talk about they were adjacent and the noise from the kids and the people outside in the back. But to me, that's adverse impact, which is bucket 4. So I didn't have any issues with the site size and the accommodation other than thinking through that parking.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Blanchard.
Well, I asked this question directly of Mr. Erstad, and again, we got about the same kind of answer that we got from Chief Lee and Chief Niemeyer. And so I went and looked up, this is a little bit of a stretch, but what they're talking about here is actually a much more expanded sense of services that would turn this shelter much more into like a healthcare facility. So, and there are American Institute of Architects guidelines for design and construction of hospital and healthcare facilities. You can go look them up. So one, under section 3.1.c, it addresses security, and it says the health facilities shall have security measures for patients, guests, families, personnel, and the public consistent with the conditions and risks inherent in the location of the facility. So again, we're not referencing our code, but I asked this question directly about, well, what are the standards of practice for designing this kind of facility? And we were just not given an answer, and the guidelines are there. So I will also tell you that it says, and again, guests, patients, whatever we want to call residents, in the development plan, it says in section 7.2.A2, in new construction, patient rooms shall be constructed to meet the needs of the functional program and have a minimum of 100 square feet of clear floor area per bed. In multi-bed rooms and 120 square feet of clear floor area for single bedrooms, exclusive of toilet rooms, closets, lockers, wardrobes, alcoves, and vestibules. So it's all there. How big does this facility need to be? Well, it needs to be a lot bigger for 200 plus and overflow. It's not big enough. It can't possibly be big enough. And I know
Commissioner Blanchard, I'm curious because you referenced there as patients, but I know that I think the public has been like, we're hearing them as residents of the shelter.
right. And so I tried to make that distinction in the beginning, is that what we've been described in this facility is that it's turning much more into a care facility. We've got Terry Riley involved. We've got so there's a lot of other things happening there that makes this more like a residential care facility. So nevertheless, if it's just a guest facility for people to sleep, and then they're going to try to provide some wraparound services, the neighborhood association clearly outlined numerous shelters in Salt Lake City that are completely different than what is happening here as far as size and scale. And I know again, I noted that I've built these kind of things before, and one of my colleagues just finished building a 15,000 square foot temporary housing facility in Merced County, and that's to house 75 residents.
I guess
So this is to argue, it should be pretty easy to understand, Commissioner Stead, is that this site is not big enough for what they are envisioning. And there's plenty of data that you can point to see that that is the case.
I question, I guess, how, when we're looking at when we use our city code to make decisions, I question what other municipalities or, what their code really has to do with our code.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Mooney. Commissioner Mooney. Oh,
for the record, Madam Chair, James Smith, Deputy City Attorney, I'd just like to clarify for purposes of further deliberations on this, and I'm not sure where the architectural standards that Commissioner Blanchard refers to came from, and whether or not they are in the record, but I would just caution the commission as a whole, if any of that's going to be considered or relied upon, that would need to be in the record somewhere. So just want to put that out there. And while I'm on the mic, just getting back to Commissioner Mooney's comment about he referenced offsite improvements, and there was some comment about being able to or not being able to impose such improvements as a condition. Just want to clarify that that the commission shouldn't worry so much about the distinction between on-site versus off-site, and concern itself more in looking at what improvements might be considered, where they are, whether they have a nexus to the site and a nexus to impacts from the site, and whether they're imposing that kind of a condition would be roughly proportional to what impacts you're trying to mitigate. So really focusing on a nexus and proportionality there, that I'd caution the commission, rather than an artificial distinction like on-site, off-site. That could, you do have a fairly broad discretion there, mindful of the nexus and proportionality. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Great. I think Commissioner Mooney.
Madam Chair.
Yes, great.
To Commissioner Blanchard's comments, I'm up here with not that expertise, so it's kind of tough for me to make a judgment on what the correct size. There was a lot of testimony regarding the appropriate size, the appropriate number of guest beds, and all that. And just from my lay perspective, I defer to the experts on this. And I was amazed at the amount of detail and research that the neighbors did in understanding this problem. I mean, they treated it with wonderful compassion about what's the right thing to do here, trying to inform the applicant, it appeared. But when those other jurisdictions came into my thought process, I had a hard time bringing them in because they're not our code. And that's one of the things that was stressed to me as the new guy, is impose our code on behalf of the city council. So read it and impose it. And I think there was lots of great lessons learned from that in the Shelter Better Task Force and the testimony. The VP&A report is amazing. And those ought to all inform improvements to our code.
Thank you, Commissioner Mooney.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
And then just in relation to square footage per person, I think, personally, I'm comfortable. My extent of comfort in terms of square footage is how the city references it, which is the International Building Code. So square footage per person must comply with the International Building Code. That's a condition of approval. That's kind of a requirement. I think personally, as it meets the International Building Code, that's the extent of my reach into square footage per person.
Okay. Okay, so then moving on to the big one, which is adverse impacts.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
So I've burned a lot of sleep time, or wish I was sleeping thinking about this one. And I'm going to just say, I'll give a summary, and then if you want, I can talk a lot more. We heard a lot of testimony. Almost all of the testimony to me fits into the adverse impact bucket. And we heard two kinds of testimony. The first, and by far the largest amount, was conjectural, or I will characterize it as conjectural. In other words, it wasn't specific to a person, a who. The what of it, the what impact was everything from serious violent crime to loitering and littering. The when was basically completely unspecified, any time after the center opened. And the where was over a huge space. So we heard adverse impact testimony thousands of feet away on the Greenbelt, at Willow Lane, in the subdivisions all around, up and down State Street, at facilities, a half a mile away. So if we think of like trying to connect that testimony to this application, I use the good old fashioned who, what, when, where. Like, what's the nexus? What's the link? And a lot of the testimony was just no clear nexus to me. That's block one. Block two. So I'm not that worried about block one. What I am worried about is block two of sort of the evidentiary record, which has to do with police calls and EMS calls. Because those are facts on the record. But the interesting thing, and I haven't made a conclusion on this one, all of those police and EMS call data were from the applicant's existing site. That's not this site. So it's not normal for this commission to look at, say, a developer's other site and apply data from that other site to a new site, if you get what I'm saying, right? So we have to be pretty sure that there's a good analogy, that there's really a good reason to believe that we'll see similar behavior or similar evidentiary behavior at the new site from the old one. So if we were in a logic class, how do you know if an analogy is a good one? Well, in this case, it's the same management team. It's the same general client group. It's kind of the same set of services, maybe more, but it's a very different location. So the problem for me is trying to understand how much should we infer from the police and EMS data from one site to another site.
I think that's really tricky to do. And I'd like to hear other commissioners' perspectives, but I think that's tricky to do because where they are now, like you're saying, is a very different location with other shelter homes nearby that wouldn't necessarily be sharing the same space. I think we had heard that on the record is kind of like, it's really hard to say,
right,
this overflow or what have you is a product of interfaith because it may have been this or it might have been this, So I think that's really tricky to do.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Blanchard.
So 1 hour ago, the impact fee advisory people stood here and presented data on how we are designing impact fees based upon EMS and fire data gleaned from particular types of sites. So for example, if we cite an Albertsons, we know how much traffic's going to go through there. We know.
Commissioner Blanchard, I'm sorry to to interrupt, but I just want to add, just to remind us of Mr. Smith's comment of keep our testimony as best we can to the record, the public record that we heard up until the end of December 13th hearing. Please carry on.
Madam Chair, less than 2 minutes ago, you said, I'd be interested to hear what other commissioners had to hear about inferring data from one location to another. So that's what this question is answering. So again, if we put in an Albertsons or we put in a Winco, we know how many times the police are going to be called based upon shoplifting and other things that happen in the store, right? So we can infer that from one Albertsons to another Albertsons if we cite that. So we do this all the time when we cite anything, multifamily, retail, a gun shop, a gas station. We do this constantly when we approve. So for all of a sudden for us to go, oh, we don't infer data from one site type to another, that doesn't make any sense.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
But I think in this particular case, maybe similar to an Albertsons, we kind of have a little bit of a precedent, if you will, as to, this use already exists elsewhere. So we have some idea of well, what call volume might come in. We have an idea, or at least a preconceived notion as to what could possibly happen. However, I think the big difference there is, dissimilar from perhaps an Albertsons, this use is clustered around similar uses that, how do they interact with each other? How does that apply? Moving one Albertsons from another, that doesn't interact quite the same as moving Interfaith from the location it exists to this new location where it's clustered to somewhat similar uses, but they're not quite the same as the uses that are there currently. I think that's, in my mind, that is the question.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Danley.
This part of the discussion for me is a little frustrating because it gets into a little bit of the social commentary that we hear. And we did hear a bit that being homeless is akin to being problematic. We know that's not true. We know that's not the case. But we do know that there is a small contingent of folks who are going to unfortunately be part of the things that our police department have very clearly stated, especially in the SEPTED report. And that's unfortunate. It is really unfortunate, but it's a reality. I work in the world of transportation. You want to talk about forecasts, right? We have a voluminous book called the Highway Capacity Manual that forecasts and predicts every single type of land use and square footage there is under the sun to try to give us information on what we might anticipate. Does it all come to fruition? No. Are there mitigation plans based upon it? Yes. So we do the best that we can with the information that we know from the past to project into the future. Is it flawed? I'll be the first to say that in that industry, yes, it is. I can't say that the SEPTED report is going to be 100% accurate, but you know what? If 50% of it is accurate, then we're going to have some issues, which is going back to the previous issue.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
So I'll just put my cards on the table. And if I thought that the new IFS location would have the same number of police and EMS calls and the same level of behavior generating those in the new location, I would vote against the application because I think that would be too much adverse impact. So the question for me is, so the payoff pitch question for me is, I asked the police chief, I said, if basically they comply with the conditions and develop a good security plan, would they be a good shelter, which he said would mitigate these impacts? He said, yes. So now I have the testimony of the chief of police saying, and his memo dated November 5th saying, if they do this and they do it correctly, he thinks it would, mitigate these impacts. That was his testimony. So now the question is back again to this guarantee or this, we don't have that plan. This is Chris's point, and I'm still sort of stuck and going back and forth. But I just want, as we deliberate, I concluded that the analogy between the current site and the proposed site was strong enough that I would be able to use that police and EMS data in formulating my decision with respect to criteria 4. So that's kind of where I'm at, is can we build in enough secure or sense of certainty that what the police chief said will happen would happen.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Meany.
my thought process was along the same lines in that we're asked to project forward, predict the future, and rely on the expert testimony of, in this case, the Chief Lee. And that's difficult to do without those detailed conditions that Commissioner Danley's talking about. So I guess I'm regurgitating what Commissioner Gillespie just said, but we're basically asked to trust the experts. And at the risk of our neighbors in Veterans Park neighborhood, that's a tough one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tough.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
And maybe a way to look at it too is maybe the current conditions are worst case scenario. I mean, not all of those items or all of those uses are moving over here. So that truly would be worst case scenario, potentially. The SEPTAD report does contain conclusions and items to consider to help mitigate some of those impacts. Maybe viewing it in that light, how you this is, in my mind, a sort of a reactive report to conditions. Viewing some of these SEPTAD conclusions and some of the items listed in there as mitigation for maybe potentially the worst case scenario. It could be a starting spot too.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Danley.
Getting back to Commissioner Gillespie's original point about the who, what, and where, I think that this report does get to it, meaning the SEPTAD report. It talks about the half-mile radius around the site. It talks about the percentages. It talks about dates. And just reading right off the report, it talks about the perspective change from one site to the other, saying a 473% higher police call volume. That's pretty specific in terms of a metric. The other thing that I heard you say, Commissioner Gillespie, and again, respect it tremendously, was that what Commissioner Lee said about if a plant, Chief Lee said about the applicant and the police department come together to devise a plan, is that, yeah, it could be a solid plan and things could be fine. Great. That was the hope, right? But right now we have a massive question mark on that. All we have is one perspective about the possibility of that taking place. We don't know what is going to be agreeable upon with the applicant in that, and what things can actually come together. One more point worth making. The Veterans Park Plan. We have specific things in there that say, and I'll quote, the Veterans Park, the neighborhood should have a high priority for increased police patrols and increased positive interaction between residents and the police department. Another point was made, special attention should be given to this neighborhood, such as increased patrols or education of the public on crime prevention to reduce the incidence of burglary, vandalism, and other crimes to the city average. How is that being considered? We have a unique situation in the city of Boise with regard to neighborhood plans. The neighborhood folks did, in my opinion, a bang up job of coming here and providing a whole slew of different perspectives. So there's yet another reason, in this case, a neighborhood plan to be involved in this relationship between the applicant and the city's police department, to devise such a plan, give feedback, and be part of the process. It's in their plan. How are we honoring that? So another maybe point worth considering here.
Okay, is there no further deliberation on the adverse impact specifically?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
I have a couple of I guess, slightly unrelated adverse impact items that I guess I kind of gleaned and just I was thinking about maybe for consideration, or I'd be interested in anybody else's input. So in terms of overflow, I think Commissioner Gillespie kind of touched on overflow a little bit in condition number 4. Yeah, with overflow in my mind comes the potential for additional vehicles. It comes potential for additional guests who may be turned away, additional guests who maybe perhaps don't pass a security screening or something like that, and they need to turn away. So I think adverse impacts could come from overflow, whether it's that additional quarter of the year, 90 days where overflow is allowed, which it's a significant part of the year, or whether it's just kind of day to day is how does that overflow handled with vehicles? I know offsite parking was mentioned briefly, but it's kind of off of the table at the moment. Things like that, and just kind of how people get to where they need to be if they can't be there. I think that could be a really significant adverse impact if people aren't able to get back to downtown or back to the location that it is currently, where they're used to, accustomed to hanging out, or accustomed to being, or wherever it is they would like to be. Another thing that I was a little bit concerned about in terms of adverse impact, or another item I had on my list, was graffiti. And I didn't see that mentioned. Maybe this is more of a DR item, but graffiti resistant materials, I think, would be perhaps prudent, or high durability materials to help keep it looking, keep some ownership to it. And then just those screening requirements, we heard it particularly in the last public hearing about those screening requirements, and just helping to mitigate the people who, because of proximity to schools and parks, helping to mitigate those requirements as well.
Madam Chairman,
Commissioner Gillespie.
can we just put a sticky marker on number 4? Because I think that's at least that's what I'm hearing. Like, there's a majority of the commission that's really worried about 4.
Yes.
And hasn't figured out what to do.
Sure. Absolutely.
So
Yes.
can we just skip to 5? Can we just deal with 5, the comp plan compliance?
Yes.
So again, the comp plan is not written in code language, right? It's written, sometimes it's aspirational, sometimes it's prescriptive. It says different things in different places and that's how it's written. So I don't have a problem with the comp plan criteria. I understand, there is this weird paragraph in the downtown section that says downtown should continue to be the center for administrative services and services for homeless people. But it's a very obscure paragraph if you read it closely. And I don't think that just based on that alone, that criteria alone, that I could deny the permit. So basically what I'm saying is I'm hung up on 4.
Yeah. Go ahead, Commissioner Moore.
Madam Chair, I think one of the bigger items in terms of the comp plan, I generally agree. I did note, ES 7.1, the Boise River System Ordinance, allow for urban interface with the river when there is no demonstrated adverse impact on wildlife habitat. I think that's probably in the adverse impact bucket. But in terms of the comp plan, I think there is potential for this to kind of encroach on that, just based on some of our public comments.
I mean, from my perspective, the current shelter is near the river, right? And we heard this so often, and I would love to hear Commissioner's perspective on this, because to me, it's like the shifting of services or something like that that we heard. It is shifting from this part of the river to that part of the river. Would we see a different burden to the natural habitat, do you think?
Mentor.
Commissioner Moore.
I think generally, yeah, I agree. I think there's a little bit of a unique situation here where it's a habitat, sort of a little bit more unique stretch of Greenbelt. But yeah, generally, I do agree with that. Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Mooney.
On the comp plan compliance, my thought was the neighborhood association was real clear that they thought it should be downtown and it is going to have some business impact was their perspective. And so I kind of looked at a little bit more deeply about the city defines it as the corridor as a level 1 area of change. And so to Commissioner Danley's point about the neighborhood plan, I'm, as the new guy, kind of struggling with, okay, what takes precedent here, this level 1 area change or an existing neighborhood plan that didn't account for the State Street corridor development?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Gillespie.
And for that reason, we generally don't hang our hat just on a comp plan designation because it's usually mixed, right? Because the comp plan has things that are written over a period of 40 years. And they're not always, tightly stitched together.
Yeah, I would say that unfortunately, this is, I think, a contention of many commissioners over the years, is that unfortunately, our city code doesn't always support the specifics of our comp plan. So although we'd love to use the comp plan as the kind of like end all of this is how we make decisions, it really, I see it, the way I understand it is that the city code kind of overrules the comp plan, and the comp plan is more like an ideal, version of things to achieve. And hopefully the next city code will maybe mirror the comp plan more specifically.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Danley.
Comprehensive planning is an incredibly thankless job. And I have been a part of it and know many planners across the state who've been, privy to it as well. I know that none of us up here are disregarding our plan. I'm not even remotely getting to that point. And I know that we do our best to try to honor our plan. And I totally recognize this very difficult relationship that the plan sometimes has because there are competing interests. Having said that, our own code says the following. Under a CUP process, purpose, to review conditionally allowed uses for compliance with the comprehensive plan, availability of services, and possible adverse impacts. It also talks about in section 1103-037, also again, backs it up, the proposed uses in compliance with the comp plan purpose of this point here. So the threshold to me is not very high in this case. This isn't a very specific application in this respect, because when you get into these two goals, and I'll say them again, I'll restate them, PDP5 require adequate public facilities and infrastructure for all development, and PDP8 require that the financial, safety, and environmental impacts from development be addressed and mitigated. Those to me are incredibly low bars to reach, meaning our plan doesn't have to get into the details of every little bit of a minutia of a different type of application that we see so often with CUP. This is pretty standard stuff. It either addresses these things, we get to it, they're mitigated, or they're not. Public safety is a very fundamental piece of comprehensive planning, and I think our plan states that repeatedly.
Okay, so is there anything else to touch upon before we circle back to adverse impacts and trying to sort through that bucket a little bit more?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Mooney.
I've got another new guy question. And it's a question that relates to item 4 and adverse impact. But it's what the neighborhood association brought up was a higher standard for a general versus a specific exemption. Can we talk about that, or can I get educated a little bit more on that?
Commissioner Gillespie.
So I am not totally sure what you're asking about. And I think we should I think what they're discussing is the fact that there's this portion of the property that is R1C and a portion that is, what is it, C2? And that the city is using a theory to why a C2 use will be allowed in the R1C. And I think this is what this discussion is about. I'm comfortable with the city's perspective on that they use the correct criteria for making that determination.
For the C2D.
That we
You mean
could
on the
use, that the C2 rules could apply to that back sliver
That's R1D.
that's
R1C.
that's R1C, and that basically, to me, I mean, we still have a problem with 4. And I think that question of a split zone on a parcel, I agree with the city's perspective on that. And I think that's what you're referring to.
Madam Chair, that's
Commissioner
good.
Mooney.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, so yeah, let's get back then to adverse impacts and see if we can come up with some ideas that would maybe help us along on the conditions for this one.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
So circling back to my question, so adverse impacts in terms of overflow, and Commissioner Gillespie is kind of alluding to condition number 4. You know, a quarter of the year is a fair amount of time, but I understand the reasoning for that. I mean, cold winter months, hot summer months, it makes sense. But it's a quarter of the year where it could potentially be not that great or overflow or overburdened. So I guess I would be interested in thoughts about how overflow is handled, if we're comfortable handling overflow just with parking ordinances, if we're comfortable handling, overflow with the guidelines, or if maybe there's something additional that's needed on that.
I'm curious because we did hear the applicant mentioned that they regularly or have no problem contacting for other available beds and using their shuttle to transport people as they're requested, right? As requested, but we know that we know that free will, and if people choose not to, then they choose not to, or if there's no available beds for those people, then such is the case. So I don't, so that could maybe be something that's worked in, but I also think that there is some, that's not 100% because people are going to choose to do what they want to do. Not everybody's going to choose to get bused back downtown or whatever the case might be, And I wonder with the parking, I mean, something that we advise neighborhoods often is that if you have trouble with your parking in your neighborhood, ask ACHD to put up the resident parking only signs, or, no overnight, permit, whatever, I mean, there's all kinds of parking restrictions. But if that is specific to the neighborhood, again, I think that would go through ACHD and not the city.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
For my mind, I'd just eliminate all overflow potential, cap it at 205, see how it runs, and let the applicant come back and ask for a change to the CUP to allow overflow. I just think asking the neighborhood to bear that uncertainty, to me, I just prefer to not have any overflow for the initial period.
I mean,
that
makes sense to me.
And let the city and the services find other places for overflow.
Yeah, and maybe and we even can say for a year or for,
I wouldn't condition, I just say no overflow, and then they can come back and ask for a CUP modification if it's really important, and the city can look at it and make a decision. But it eliminates, again, that uncertainty about the impact on this neighborhood. And by the way, I'm still not sure I can support any set of conditions. So, but, I have a trial set that I'll throw out there if you like, Madam Chairman.
Hang on a second. Okay. I mean,
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Mooney.
Regarding that, it sounds like we're talking about moving through the conditions number by number and making changes. If we do that, then obviously not obviously, but I would be in favor of that. But I also agree that this emergency overflow just complicates this application. immensely. And as a private charitable organization, if there's an emergency, I think the government ought to step up. That this organization doing great work shouldn't be burdened with some extra duty.
Okay,
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Danley.
for the record, and I recognize the timing is off, but I apologize for that. But nevertheless, here we are. Something I just wanted to address that came about from Commissioner Blanchard earlier about square footage. And that is that right out of LUPA, 67-6512, which talks about a special use permit, which is synonymous with a conditional use permit. When you get down into the language of it, section 7 says requiring potentially the possibility of requiring more restrictive standards than those generally required in an ordinance. No, I understand that. I just want to make sure that we are reminded that LUPA does give us that authority to make changes, whether they're from another body that was not part of their public record or not, that is entitled to us in LUPA. So just wanted to make sure to make that note.
Thank you. You want to take a break? Commissioner Gillespie, you okay? You want to take a break? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. We'll be back at about 7:18.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
So I'm kind of ready to, in my long-winded way, talk about the conditions that I came up with and why I'm not happy with them. And,
Okay.
and so the way I approach was to say, okay, what are the best conditions I can figure out? And then to step back a day or two later and say, okay, do I think they're going to work?
So can I ask, would you like us to,
Not yet.
okay. Go ahead.
So one, as you know, I'd get rid of the overflow. That's condition.
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Let's just,
Yeah.
not complicate.
Okay, I'm listening.
I changed condition 9 to read 8 PM, but not 9, but I'm not hard over on that one, obviously. Condition 18 is super interesting. So this is the neighborhood meeting. And as I read the condition, it's a one-time meeting. And I want it to be repeated on an annual basis. So I would change condition 18, the last sentence to me read, this meeting shall be repeated on an annual basis. So that, again, it's this ongoing mitigation and making sure that the operational and security plan work on an ongoing basis. Because that to me is the principal issue here is how do we make sure that what Chief Lee said is true?
Mhm.
And I believe LUPA allows us and our code says, we can implement conditions that guarantee the performance against the application.
Yes.
Item 20, I would change to say the security plan, I would add a sentence at the end that basically says the security plan must be approved by the director prior to the issuance of any occupancy permit. If you want building permit, fine, I don't care. But see, I'm still like very unhappy with those conditions. So I wrote out this huge long condition or set of conditions. And the basic idea is to require the applicant to produce an annual performance report, basically against the criteria in the November 5 BPD letter. So that letter talks about intake, procedures, medical issues, EMS data, police data. So I tried to say, let's design a report as a condition that says something like, the applicant shall complete an annual performance report for the purpose of addressing their ongoing compliance with the security plan referenced in Objective 20 and other conditions of this permit. The report shall be submitted to the PFS director for review and approval not later than 14 days prior to the annual community meeting referenced in condition 18. So, and then I actually started writing down, the report shall contain the following items, blah, 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 blah. And it went on and on. And then I looked back, and then I waited a week because I have been thinking about this nonstop for
3 months at least.
Freaking weeks. Yeah. And I said, well, wait a minute. So again, there's two big problems. One, it's not a public process, right? We can't write a condition that compels the city to do anything, right? That's not what a land use decision does. And the second problem is how does the PFS director acquire the expertise or the skill to manage that reporting and feedback process to the applicant? And so we don't have in the city an expert on this issue, maybe in the police department, but I don't know. So I couldn't figure out when I look back at it that this was really going to work. So I took my best shot at conditioning this to mitigate the adverse impact, and I couldn't do it. I'm open to other people's best shot.
What if instead of PDS then, if it was something like because I know the mayor's office has staff that works on
stuff.
Yeah, works on partnerships and works with people experiencing homelessness. And could it go to the mayor's office then instead? You don't know.
I see, this is the problem, because then the problem actually shifts from what the applicant does at this site and this permit to how the city handles it. And I'm really uncomfortable sitting up here and approving a permit that's predicated on the city doing a whole bunch of things that they're not doing now, or that I don't know, or that aren't in the record.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Mooney.
Commissioner Finfrock asked a question at the first testimony regarding our city's record on permits, conditional use permits, and have we ever gone back on them and the procedure for that? And obviously it's in the enforcement section of our code. And then James made a comment, I think at the last hearing regarding there is a way to condition a permit, i.e. timestamp it. So would that be a way ahead to have, instead of an annual review a year from now? Because I asked this question in my first hearing, which was, that's an informational meeting, which it doesn't give the neighbors any assurance that anything's going to happen. But if the conditional use permit was time stamped and it's good for a year, but there's a quarterly review going up to that, and a year from now, there's another round of public hearing, does that work?
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
So that is a really good question. And LUPA and our code allows us to time limit permits. But think really hard about that for a minute, especially when there's a massive capital outlay by the applicant. So the applicant spends millions of dollars. They may or may not be, by the way, if we time limit the permit, who knows about their financing? So the problem with time stamping it, maybe it's tantamount to a denial from the app, because the applicant basically builds out a new building, they invest millions. And then if 3 years from now, we go through a CUP process again, and it's denied, the applicant, to me, then it gets into the takings issue and all that. Now we can do it. There's no question we can do it.
It would be a good incentive.
But the question is it wise? And I concluded it's probably not a wise thing to do. It's probably more wise just to have experts design an operational and security plan that the commission has faith in. But I'm open to other thoughts on that.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Mooney.
I appreciate that line of reasoning. I, as you can see, I'm trying to bend over to accommodate what is obviously an immensely important mission that this charitable organization is up to. And that was just one way. So I appreciate that would be problematic, but it almost seems as if from their testimony, they would take that leap, but they'd be at risk of, or we, the city, would be at risk of future problems legally. I don't know.
I thought long and hard about that. For like 2 days, I thought, yay, I found the solution, and I slept better for like 2 days.
I mean, what if it was not 1 year, but like after 5 years, and they did these annual meetings to review? I mean, that would be, it'd be a ample amount of time to kind of work with the neighborhood to, work out the kinks and make sure that they're following the conditions and trying to make things work. Just another idea.
Yeah, I thought, yep.
Yeah.
Madam Chairman, thank you.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
Another way to go about it too could be, I know a lot of public comment was oriented around the number of guests, maybe lowering the number of guests, then after a certain period of time, the applicant can come back and increase the number of guests if we see the adverse impacts are not occurring. That could also be a way to kind of mitigate some of that. I mean, that's a suggestion by the neighborhood itself.
I know, I actually see that. I support that through the idea of removing the emergency overflow, and then if things are going well, then we can come back to revisit that emergency number if they're able to handle. But so I agree with you on that. line of reasoning in that sense.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
But perhaps even lowering it from 205 to
Mhm.
Yeah.
something else. I mean, that could.
Madam
that could
Chairman.
help.
Commissioner Gillespie.
So I wrote that one down too, that idea. And we could even, this is what happens when it's late at night. No, year one, 100 beds, year two, 150 beds, year three, 205 beds. So you could graduate it in and see how it runs. That just seems like, again, micromanaging from the dice on the core of their business. An advantage of doing that way, however, is that at any time they can come back and ask for a CUP modification to change it. And then we can do this all over again. So I thought about that. The other problem I had with thinking about that, Madam Chairman, was I couldn't figure out what the right number was.
Right. Well, I mean, and if we're
Like,
being told.
That's why we asked Ms. Decker.
Right.
I asked her in the testimony, what do you think the right number?
Right.
She went, 100. Well, I'm not sure that we can lean on Katie Decker to pick that number. And again, so I was back to, I don't know what the right number really is. It may be less than 205. The current center operates at what, 150-ish?
Yeah.
So, and we see the impacts that they have. So that's why I didn't, in the end, think that that was the right idea.
Yeah.
Madam Chairman.
Commissioner Gillespie.
Where is it? I always forget the number of this damn thing.
Item number 1.
No.
2126.
Let's just try it. Are you ready for a motion?
Bring it.
Madam Chairman, I move that we deny CUP 21-26 because it has too much adverse impact and it isn't mitigated by the current conditions.
Second.
Was that a second from Commissioner Blanchard?
Madam Chairman,
Commissioner Gillespie.
I just can't figure out how to get conditions in that mitigate the adverse impact to that neighborhood.
Madam Chair.
I think the adverse impact is pretty clearly demonstrated in the current level of EMFs and police calls. It's referenced in the report. What do you call that thing? The SEPTED report, as well as, the current EMS and police data. And I just didn't see in the record submitted adequate plans to mitigate that. And I don't know, I cannot develop conditions that do that for me.
As I made the second, Madam Chair, I'll
Commissioner Blanchard.
give you my, Commissioner Gillespie, I came to the same, it's funny, the things I had on my list were, limiting the term of the permit and limiting the number of people, and there would be a couple of the conditions. But again, if I'm the applicant, I've already played this chess game all the way through, and I wouldn't be interested in those terms from us. So there isn't any reason for us, again, as I stated earlier, I think it's important that we all get the record full of what our objections are to this and what we'd like to see, and then let the applicant, move on and do what they're going to do. But I didn't see a way that we could condition our way out of this. I just didn't see it. So, my findings are that the location is not compatible to other uses in the general neighborhood. The C2 district is described on page 330 of the comp plan, says that the primary uses there should be convenience, neighborhood, community, regional shopping centers, hotels and motels, car sales, restaurants, entertainment, and similar uses. And then it specifically calls out limited outpatient medical uses, which is really, what we're talking about at this point in time. So I'll leave it at that one. I think that the proposed use will place an undue burden on public facilities in the vicinity, specifically Fire Station 5 and the unstaffed BPD Willow Lane location. Commissioner Danley's already talked about PDP 5 and the requirement of adequate public facilities and infrastructure for all development. And I'll throw in PDP 9, which is that to work to ensure that public facilities are well located, and they are currently not. I've already argued that the site is not large enough to accommodate the proposed use quite a bit. The neighborhood association put forth all kinds of examples on that. The proposed use will adversely affect other property in the vicinity. That violates our goal NAC 3 to enhance the character of established neighborhoods, and thus also NAC 3.1, encouraging residential infill that complements the scale and character of the surrounding neighborhood. And goal EC3 to protect the economic climate for existing businesses and promote opportunities for expansion. EC 3.1 supporting existing business, and EC 3.2 protecting business from encroachment. And I agree with one of the statements made earlier by Commissioner Mooney that I think it is a really heavy lift and there's not much we can do. But I mean, IFS is going this thing alone, and that is a shame. PDP 4 says that the city's supposed to be taking a leadership role in planning and coordinating regional growth. And that would include providing these kind of services to these kind of residents. And what's happened out throughout the valley is that everybody has exported their homelessness to Boise. So that's all the way from Weiser, Ontario, everybody. And there needs to be a lot more of a solution than IFS going this alone. And there's not much that anybody can really do about that, but that's also in the comp plan as well. So those are my chief reasons for not supporting this application. It's just not gonna be easy for us to condition to make this thing work.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Danley.
bear with me, please. It's been 3 months. Got a few things I wanted to say. I am going to be in support of the motion. I'm sure that comes as no surprise. I want to start by addressing the applicant and the other folks in this room, the public, our staff, and my fellow commissioners. To the applicant, this isn't something I want to do. This isn't something I don't think any of us want to do. It drives me nuts that this state doesn't help out in this issue more than it does. We don't fund the Housing Trust Fund. We have so few limited tools. The applicant is absolutely not, a person trying to ruin any part of a city. They're doing everything that they can to support a part of this city that needs support. And it kills me that this is where we are. But nevertheless, it is what I do believe at this point in time anyway is the right thing to do. With regard to the public, a lot of folks were part of this process. A lot of folks wrote us. A lot of folks came and spoke to us. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. And I appreciate that. I know that some things were maybe said that maybe shouldn't have been with regard to some folks who might be homeless. I regret hearing some of those things, but I also regret hearing that the neighborhood by and large is nothing but NIMBYs, because I don't believe that to be true as well. I think there's a lot of concern on both sides of the aisle here, and it's being worked out in this discussion. Lastly, to the staff, you all never get thanks. You never get appreciation. And I know you wear this at home. I know that you wear this at your day job every day, of course. And I know all of us appreciate your efforts and your hard work, and it always is behind the scenes, but thank you. And just quickly to my fellow commissioners, same thing. For the last 3 months, I know all of you have taken this home, had sleepless nights and so forth, trying to figure out how to navigate this application. And so for me, I appreciate that as well. You need a reason statement. I'll give this one to you. A conditional use permit cannot be granted due to the lack of information regarding mitigating the adverse effect that the development and or operation of the proposed use may have upon other properties or upon the ability of political subdivisions to provide services for the proposed use. That's where I am. We just simply don't have enough information. I can say with a full heart that I've tried as best I can to try to get us there. I know that to be the case, and I was disappointed in some of the responses. I really want to go further. I really want to say more. especially having experienced certain comments that were made, especially at the second hearing, that I didn't think were right. We were, I will say this, sort of accused of injecting our own personal beliefs or whatever the comment was made. That was nothing but a distraction from our responsibility as a commission, as per LUPA, as per our code, as to representing the public, the commission, the city, and the applicant. That's what we have to do. So the effort that we put forward that night was about that, pure and simple. That's all it was. So for all of those reasons, for everything I've said, this is why I'll be supportive of the motion.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Mooney.
I'll support the motion as well. As the new guy, I agree with the staff and the applicant that this is a compatible use. I guess I disagree with, I'm not in the same place Commissioner Blanchard is on this, but I support the motion, which is this is a compatible use. The site's large enough. It's consistent with the comp plan. There's no undue burden. And I humbly disagree with the staff assessment that the shelter will not adversely impact the property in the vicinity, given the conditions of approval. And as we've talked about a lot, we're asked to assess the claim of future impact, and it's sleepless nights to figure that out. So I can't, in my mind, understand how we could approve this without impacting that neighborhood and all the testimony we heard. I believe the conditions should be more stringent to mitigate adverse impact, but to impose those from here is to imply that we know how to do this. So I'd really like to defer to the experts to figure this out and come back with and I greatly regret that that's going to put people on the street for maybe a bit longer, and we won't solve this problem. The applicant's been extremely accommodating throughout the process, which I've said before, and I think they would surely accept additive conditions to make this work. So I'm going to vote in support of the motion.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore.
All right. I think a lot of kind of my mind was based on, well, can we condition it properly? And being left in that sort of realm of leaning on the commission here to condition it from DICE, as opposed to it being commissioned before it makes it here or what have you. It's a tough position to be in. It's a tough format to kind of add conditions and discuss. So I get that. And, with the lack of conditions and the lack of adequate conditions, I mean, I'm looking at my notes. The concerns are definitely more densely worded than the densely kind of populated than my positive sides. Not to say that there aren't positives to this application. I think the building itself is an improvement on the existing building. Reusing an existing building is, supportive of the comp plan. I think part of it that I have trouble with is the lack of mix of uses on State Street. You have a lot of similar uses, which means that it's compatible, but also then you don't get retail or commercial. You don't get as the mix of uses that you kind of anticipate there. And then just not being just the format to condition this in a way that we're comfortable, with overflow, with safety to adjacent properties, even the 10-foot fence was a little bit hard to pallet, something I would have trouble with in my own backyard. It's a really tall wall. So things like that, it's hard to condition here. But there clearly are some conditions, and I think that sub-TED report has some reactive measures that could be utilized in the future based on real data that could help create some of these impacts that, based on our public testimony that we just experienced, we now know. I think we've got some really good, solid record of what the neighbors' concerns are and what the neighborhood concern would be to kind of apply some conditions in a better format.
Okay, so I will not be supporting the motion. This is illegal land use in this area, and I haven't given up on the conditions yet. But I think also as we move towards a vote to deny, that we need to come up with what the applicant could do in the future to be approved for this. And I don't know that we've made that clear.
Madam Chairman,
Commissioner Gillespie.
With all due respect, I think the record is clear on what kind of security and operations plan. At least there's models in the record for what they might do and what they might contain. And we see that in the SEPTED report. We see it in the some of the conditions that were imposed in some of the Utah shelters. It's just a model.
Okay,
not a
so let me
requirement.
ask staff then. Do you guys have what you need to?
Madam Chair, I think just reiterating it, just to make sure it's clear on the record, as we'll have to recraft a decision statement.
Right.
Of course, we have lots of testimony and record, but it would be good to summarize it here this evening.
Thank you. So, Madam Chairman,
Commissioner Gillespie.
obviously, in this situation, the difficulty is different commissioners have different views. My view is that the application fails in criteria 4. I find that it meets all the other criteria. It fails on criteria 4 because the level of adverse impact around the current site, I think if it was to occur at the proposed site, would be, too much. It's too adverse and it's significant. And the data, the specific data that I think supports that is the police call record data, the SEPTEP report, and the EMS reports, as well as some of the city's own internal correspondence with respect to the issues around the current site. So then I do think that the current site, it's reasonable to project some of those adverse impacts onto the new site. I went through some of those reasons as well, why I think the analogy is sound. And I just think that that level of adverse impact is significant. And I don't think the conditions in the current permit would mitigate them, because we don't really have any specific idea on how they would be mitigated. And as I said, I'm just not comfortable sort of writing a giant piece of sort of performance management text from the dais to do that. And I think the issue that if we did that, it's not really even publicly reviewable. So not only am I not qualified, but if we did it up here or tried to do it, that would be it, right? It wouldn't, we wouldn't get anybody else's expert testimony on it. So I'm really uncomfortable trying to do it.
So for those other commissioners that are, can you add to that?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Moore?
I think in my mind, when I'm considering adding conditions of approval, I'm seeing these specific items outlined in the SEPTED report, specifically on page 35 of the report, future development considerations, things like access controlled parking for residents. And I know that's a little bit different in this particular application. Landscape beds to avoid hiding spots. I think this report does outline some specific conditions, and it could potentially start to set the tone for what we expect a security plan to achieve, which would be to mitigate the impacts outlined in the SEPTED report. I think those are pretty clear and pretty evidence impacts. And so I think referencing that report as even though it's a different location with different neighbors, could help to kind of guide some of that as well.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Danley.
I'll be very specific here. Our first group of our readings was 135 pages. It, I believe, has the bulk of it, the actual staff report. The very bottom, page 133, under recommendations from the Boise Police Department. In my mind, at the very least, what needs to be brought forward are the following: bullet 1 and bullet 2. Bullet 1 reads, IFS needs to develop a contingency plan for how management and staff address guests who are no longer welcome on the property and asked to leave. The plan should include time for de-escalation, which will allow guests to continue to stay at the facility, on and on and on. The bullets in the record. Bullet number 2, IFS needs to develop a security plan to mitigate minor issues related to their property and guests, which should include private security to reduce police response. And again, that bullet is on the record. The other 2 bullets that I think need to be specifically addressed, some of them are, to be fair, but the other 2, forgive me, one has to do, it's the one that has to do with the flexibility. So, okay, it's another bullet here. IFS needs to be more flexible in their admittance time criteria to allow these guests who arrive later than predetermined check-in time. That bullet, and then there was another one with respect to the overflow. I won't read that. I think it's the second to last one. For me personally, the overflow issue is not that big of a deal. I think it needs to happen personally. We're in the midst of winter. It's cold. It's going to be single digits, just was. I have no issue with overflow. I have no issue with, 110-degree heat and people needing a place to stay and be cool. But how are we going to handle it? That's it. How are we going to handle that? How are the applicant and the police department and the neighborhood comfortable when those events occur? It's as simple as that. And I think last point is it goes back to one of the other conditions of approval with regard to the CUP has to do with the comp plan, the mitigation. That's the mitigation. If those things are determined and we can come together and present them, the public has an opportunity to see those. I think the comprehensive plan would be satisfied too, at least in my perspective, it would be, which would then again satisfy another term of the conditions. To me, it all comes down to that sort of sun in the solar system that is this notion of all things related to security.
Okay. Staff, do you feel? Yes. Okay. So the motion on the table is to deny item number 1, CUP 21-26 for Interfaith Sanctuary Housing Services at 4306 West State Street. Will the clerk please call the, will the clerk please call the vote?
Stead,
No.
Blanchard,
Aye.
Moore,
Aye.
Gillespie,
Aye.
Danley,
Aye.
Mooney.
Aye.
Motion carries 5 in favor, 1 opposed.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. And before we do, I'm going to actually recuse myself from the rest of the meeting. I have a lingering cough and you don't want to hear me continue to struggle with it. And I'm going to invite my co-chair, Commissioner Schaefer, to chair the rest of the meeting.
Yeah, totally.
That's in our coordinates.
Ready, Kevin? Okay, we'll carry on with the rest of our agenda here now. As Commissioner Stead noted, she's going to take the rest of the evening off. She's not feeling well, so I'm going to step in and run the rest of the meeting here this evening. So up next for us is item number 2. It's PUD 21-54. This is a reconsideration for a conditional use permit at 2506 West Targhee Street. The applicant is Cushing Terrell, and we're going to hear from staff first. Mr. Kevin Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. So before you is a conditional use permit for a planned residential development comprised of 46 multifamily dwellings on about 3/4 of an acre located at 2506 West Targhee Street in an R3D zone. So you'll recall you originally heard this project back on November 8th, at which time it was denied. The applicant requested reconsideration to allow for a redesign and has submitted what we'll be reviewing tonight. So just to reorientate yourselves, the property shown here in red is at the intersection of Vista and Targhee Streets. So we're just across the way from Hawthorne Elementary School up on the bench. As you can see on the zoning map there, Vista Ave has a variety of high-density residential and commercial zoning and a best-in-class transit line which connects the airport, BSU, and downtown. So this is the original proposal here. So it included 50 units and was requesting a variance to the rear yard setback, which is that section shown there in red, as well as a parking reduction. So I think it's safe to say that it was these two additional requests which ultimately led for the PUD and variance being denied. Mostly as this is all new construction and there really aren't any site-specific characteristics, which the commission thought supported these variances and reduction requests. So as a result, the applicant has redesigned the project to what you see here. So with a reduction of 4 units and the reconfiguration of the site and bedroom counts, the setback along the east is being met, and all the required parking is being provided for on site. They've also addressed some of the other recommended conditions of approval from the original application, including starting the process to consolidate the parcel and detaching the sidewalks. It's also important to note here that the project is still utilizing the housing bonus ordinance, so which will now result in 7 income restricted units. So, I mean, considering that the planning team supported the original proposal and the applicant appears to have addressed the main concerns brought forth by the commission, we are recommending approval of the application with conditions. Proposal does comply with the required planned unit development findings, and it is compatible with the general neighborhood and will provide an increased diversity of housing options in the area. Due to the location along the transit corridor and other neighborhood amenities and the inclusion of affordable housing, the proposal is supported by numerous goals and policies of Blueprint Boise. And just as a reminder, the commission is the deciding making body on PUDs.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Next, we'll hear from the applicants.
My name is Brian Hallowell with Cushing Terrell Architects. Address is 800 West Main Street, Suite 800, Boise, Idaho. And I'd like to thank you all for all of your service to the community. And I see that you're doing a lot of great work and putting a lot of effort into what you're doing. I appreciate you allowing us to come back with a reconsideration. What we discovered at the last hearing in the denial of the application was a concern over quantity of parking within the neighborhood. And there was denial of the use of on-street parking. And with that, we took the project back to the drawing board. And as Kevin had noted, reduced the scale and scope of the project down to 46 units, brought in the required parking amount. So that's all accommodated on site. And we're not utilizing any of the on-street parking for any of the project. So that's completely out of the equation. And we have utilized the parking that's provided we are meeting the code requirements with the parking that's required for the quantity of units and unit types that we have. So with that, additional adjustments to the project have been relocation of the sidewalks or detachment of the sidewalks to provide parkway strips along both Vista and Targhee, pulling the sidewalk off. We've maintained the entrance to the driveway or the driveway entrance to the parking internal to the site as far east as we can for safety. We still have a concern about safety at the intersection of Vista and Targhee, just keeping pedestrians away from the movement of vehicles in and out of the parking lot. And additional adjustments that have been made, and I would say benefit the project greatly, are that in reduction of the quantity of units has taken the massing down of the project a bit, roughly to the tune of about 28 feet. Don't take me for specifics on that, but we've taken it down quite a bit. And it's opened up, reduced the massing, opened it up, and it's allowed us to provide additional landscaping buffer, eliminating the need for the variance that we had requested for the landscape buffer and setback along the driveway. So we've pulled that completely off and done a double-loaded parking driveway and provided outdoor space along that east property line that is accommodating the bicycle parking and also providing outdoor space for picnic tables and green space and a pet area outside. Other adjustments are just with the detachment of the sidewalk. We were originally planning on keeping the 3 trees that are along Vista, but in review with the city of Boise, the request was that we detach the sidewalk to improve the streetscape of Vista for our piece of property. And in doing so, the trees could not maintain because the sidewalks would take up the same footprint that the trees currently exist within. So the trees, with that concession, the trees would have to be taken out. We would prefer to keep those, but that's one of the things that we've had to do to get the sidewalk detached there. Other elements, just to reiterate, it's 46 units, 41 parking stalls, no on-street parking, no variances are requested. Pedestrian safety is something of great concern, which is why we've located the entry drive where we have on the east side of the property. We've also, the project has also benefited from increased landscaping and landscaping setback along the east property line as well. Other than that, I think the project remains relatively intact with its original design in terms of massing, height, and all of those elements that meet the code as we understand. So that's all I have to say on it. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. Next, we will hear from the Neighborhood Association. I believe we have some folks online. It's the Vista, right? Vista Neighborhood Association. Yep.
Hi there. My name is Mia Russell. I'm the Vice President of the Vista Neighborhood Association, and I just wanted to read a letter that we have drafted as a board regarding this application. So this letter is to offer support with thoughtful considerations to the application at 2506 West Targhee Street. The Vista Neighborhood Association has reviewed the amended site plan for this project, and we appreciate that the developer has retooled the available parking and will no longer be requesting a variance for the access road. We also like that the developer has opted to include some affordable housing units under the city's housing bonus ordinance. We recognize that this property is ideal for this since it's on a major thoroughfare with established transit routes. With no variance requested and the new site plan fitting within current and established zoning code for the site, we understand that the increase in density is inevitable to some extent. With that said, we hope to offer collaborative feedback as this process moves forward. Our primary concern, and we hope your most important consideration, is the impact on traffic and congestion when it comes to our neighborhood school. Hawthorne Elementary is located nearly across the street, and it serves 400 students Monday through Friday. Many of the students walk and or bike to the school, including directly by the proposed development and surrounding streets. With the increased need for on-street parking and increased